What's up guys? Before we get into today's review, I wanted to quickly tell you all that I've launched a new YouTube channel. It's called WTP Productions and it's all about Pokemon. Pokemon is probably the one thing I love more than animated shows from the late 90s and 2000s, so I'm pretty excited to start turning that passion into awesome videos. There's going to be reviews of the Pokemon games in the same style as my reviews on this channel, in-depth videos about Pokemon history, mysteries and unsolved questions, and even a podcast dedicated to reviewing every episode of the Pokemon anime. If any of this sounds interesting to you, I'd love if you checked out the channel and subscribed if you like what you see. I've taken up enough of your time though, so let's get stuck into what you're really here for. My name's Brandon and this is Cartoon Network Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Cartoon Network shows and retrospectively review them. Today I'm reviewing yet another Ben 10 game. Wait a minute, I'm not reviewing another Ben 10 game? Really? Are you sure? Well, apparently I get a slight reprieve from Ben 10 games for the moment. Instead, we're reviewing Johnny Test on the Nintendo DS. Now, Johnny Test isn't a show I'm too familiar with. As a kid, it never really grabbed my attention, and like most of the other shows I've talked about that I wasn't into, it didn't seem to get much love from Cartoon Network Australia. I'm honestly not sure I've ever sat down and watched a full episode. Pretty much the only thing I know about the show is that it's a bit of a meme on the internet. I've heard many people talk about it as if it's this absolute abomination. So naturally, my expectations for this are pretty low. It ran for 6 seasons though, so it must have found some sort of audience. This audience would be the very reason Cartoon Network decided to take a break from milking Ben 10 and try something else in the video game space. Johnny Test was released on March 29, 2011 for the Nintendo DS, the first Cartoon Network game released exclusively on that platform since Code Lyoko Fall of Xana way back in 2008. Handheld consoles are usually a popular destination for licensed games, so I'm surprised we had such a drought of exclusive titles. The developers in charge were Sarbacan Games, who still exist today, mostly developing iOS titles. Back in the day they developed almost nothing of note, and in fact, much of their catalogue of work seemed to be browser games. More interesting to me is the publisher for Johnny Test. 505 Games were in charge here, who some of you might recognise. They have published dozens of games, most recently taking charge of putting Death fucking Stranding on PC. They really went from Johnny Test to Death Stranding. This is the true embodiment of started from the bottom, now we're here. Over the years they've published things like Wild Arms 4, Mean Girls, Terraria, Rocket League and Control, a very mixed catalogue. As far as I can find, this game was the only time they ever worked on a video game that was based on an animated film or show. Only 3 reviews of this game exist on Metacritic. They gave the game a 7, 6.5 and a 3. A whole lot of variance there. I tried to find a review from somewhere like IGN, but all I discovered was this absolutely batshit insane article written about the game. First of all, apparently Johnny Test was just shadow dropped. Like, the game had no release date, then suddenly, bam, 505 Games sends out a press release saying it's available. Secondly, the whole article reads as if it's just an advertisement for the game. Thirdly, the article has a fucking quote from Johnny Test himself, as if he gave an interview about the game. Finally, the article was updated a year after it was posted for some reason. What the fuck is going on here? To top it all off, not much info about this game exists on YouTube. A single tool-assisted speedrun was about the most visual info I could find about this game. There is so much weird stuff going on here. Let's head into the actual game itself and see if that continues on. A lot of the background for this game is complete insanity, as I just detailed, so I was pleasantly surprised when I booted this up and it was just a regular-ass platformer. I've mentioned this before, but Cartoon Network has actually had a distinct lack of traditional platformers over the years, so it's always a nice surprise to see one. Johnny Test plays out as a typical 2D side-scrolling platformer. I think my most accurate summary of how it plays is that it's a combination of Mario and Mega Man. That's a pretty lofty comparison to make, and Johnny Test certainly isn't even close to competing with those two series. However, it may shock you to know that I thought this game was genuinely good. It hasn't reinvented the wheel. In fact, this is just the wheel without any changes whatsoever. But I'll be damned if that wheel doesn't work. For example, what is the most important gameplay aspect of a platformer? Jumping, naturally. Well, Johnny Test nails jumping. Having played countless bad platformers over the years, some of which came from Cartoon Network, I've experienced my fair share of clunky jumping mechanics. Here everything works perfectly, it never feels like a complete struggle to pull off jumps, and the movement made for such a free-flowing nature throughout levels. It's just a tight platforming experience, and I can't say I had even a single issue with it. As you could imagine, you also have the ability to run, making those longer and tricky jumps possible. While the gameplay does start off as a run-of-the-mill 2D side-scroller, it does start to vary a little. Each of the game's 3 worlds has a unique theme to it, introducing a new villain and new setting. Over the course of the game you'll see levels based on medieval, snow and laboratory settings. This theme of constant change also carries over to Johnny himself. In the opening level you play as regular Johnny, who, just like Mario, can only defeat enemies by pounding on their head. This all changes in the second level, where Johnny embraces his superhero alter ego, giving him access to a range of legitimate attacks. This changes the way you can tackle levels, however the game never forces you into a specific playstyle. You can still play through levels without using those abilities, however there are definitely cases where embracing them will make life easier for you. Finally, in the last world, Johnny gets access to a Mega Man style blaster, which is where the game transforms to be more in the style of that particular series. The changing up of theming when it comes to settings is a stock standard video game trope for platformers, but I thought the idea to have Johnny also change alongside it was brilliant. The new wrinkles in the gameplay kept things fresh, which is a pretty key thing to making a platformer that is enjoyable to play after the first 5 minutes. The rest of the game is quite generic fare, although it's hard to complain too much about it being generic when it works well. Levels are littered with pizza slices, or maybe Doritos, not really too sure, which increases a meaningless score. You've also got all your typical power-ups for invisibility and health, and 1-ups can be discovered to give you more lives. What's a little different is that you can actually upgrade your maximum health here. Small additions like that aren't complete game changers, but they do add extra bits of life into the game. Similarly, Johnny has about half a dozen power-ups he can unlock to help him during the game. What I liked most about these is that, as far as I could tell, these are completely optional for the most part. Apart from maybe the jetpack, I don't think anything is 100% necessary to use in completing the game. To get these power-ups, you'll have to search for power cells scattered throughout levels. Some of these are basically handed to you, but most of them are way off the beaten path, forcing you to explore if you want them. And luckily, the reward for exploring is worth it. The power-ups are generally more powerful attacks that will make life easier for you, particularly in the end of world boss battles. At this point, I'm basically just gushing over this game. Who would have thought that, in the year 2020, I would be gushing over a Johnny Test game on the Nintendo DS? Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. While none of my negatives are too massive, they do bring the game down slightly. The most pressing of these issues is the game's length. You might have noticed that I mentioned just 3 different settings earlier. Well, those are the only 3 settings in the game. This game has just 3 worlds. These 3 worlds are made up of 4 levels each, meaning this game has 12 levels total. It took me roughly 30 minutes to beat each world, meaning my final time clocked in around 90 minutes. Ouch. I'm sure a kid playing this would take a whole lot longer, but anybody who's played at least a handful of platformers in their life will breeze through this. Honestly, the game feels like it's incomplete. The 3 worlds here feel like the introduction to a much longer game. It's if Sarbacan Games created the tutorial worlds, but then accidentally shipped the game without including the rest of it. After beating the final boss, I was ready for even more worlds, but unfortunately there's nothing left to discover. It's a real shame because I feel like they could have kept innovating if things were longer, which definitely would have given the game a genuine identity rather than mostly feeling like a Mario clone. Speaking of the final boss battle, it stinks. I guess the idea behind it isn't too bad, but the execution of it is very clumsy and very tedious. It takes at least half a dozen hits to chip away 1 dot of his health, which makes it go on for way too long. Perhaps it would have been easier if I had attained the next power-up, but I still think it's a little absurd how long this takes. Graphically, the game is a bit of a disappointment too. I guess the actual levels aren't too bad, but Johnny himself is a pixelated mess. You don't pay heaps of attention to his character model because you're busy zipping around levels, but every time I stopped to look at it, I was far from impressed.
Take 1 part spiky hair, 2 parts Genius Sisters, a dash of talking dog, mixed thoroughly, and the result is an action-packed animated series about a boy willing to try anything in the name of science. When Johnny meddles with one of the Genius twin sisters' out-of-this-world science experiments, he plunges the town of Pork Belly into chaos. Johnny and his loyal pooch Dookie must break all the rules in order to save his friends. Play through 12 mind-bending levels of non-stop adventure. Play as Johnny or his alter egos, Johnny X and Trooper J. Play with an incredible collection of gadgets from the laboratory. Push the limits of reality with Johnny Test, a new physics-bending platformer adventure for Nintendo DS.
I didn't think I'd be saying this, but Johnny Test for the Nintendo DS is a genuinely good game. It has managed to ascend from good for a licensed game status all the way to just a flat out good game. Don't go into it expecting anything revolutionary, because it's mostly derivative of those that came before it. But as I've mentioned throughout this review, it pulls off almost everything to a satisfactory level. It even has a decent level of challenge for older gamers here. It's far from the walk in the park you might be expecting. Looking at Sarbacan Games' pedigree, I really wasn't expecting much from them, but from what I've seen here, they have genuine talent. It's a real shame that it's so short. So much potential is left sitting on the table. And with that, we've reviewed the final Cartoon Network game that would be exclusive to the Nintendo DS. While the 3DS will get some love from Adventure Time and Regular Show, handheld gaming mostly falls out of favour from this point onwards. More importantly, with Johnny Test out of the way, it's time for the review everyone has been waiting for. Strap yourselves in, next episode is a review you're not going to want to miss.